you asked about the kind of phenotype of individual that may think, oh, this is for me, is rather than generalize it as anxiety, generalize it as sympathetic tone, I think, and try to provide an explanation of what that may be. There's a great book actually by Dr. Stephen Porges called Anchored. I'm pretty sure he's the guy that pioneered polyvagal theory. Really, it's a highly contested theory, but the exercises work. That's what the research says. They seem to work, but it might not be because of this reason, but whatever, they work.
Isn't that the same with a lot of things?
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't care. Who cares? Yeah.
Do your clientele care? Why?
Yeah.
You know?
Because anxiety is a matter of perception, isn't it? I think. You know, some people will have excessive sympathetic tone, but it will be being excited and ready to do the thing. You know, when I'm at jiu-jitsu and I'm highly sympathetically innovated in a role, it's fantastic and I feel great. When I have to go and speak in front of an audience and I'm exactly the same amount of sympathetically innovated, it's horrible, you know. And also your ability to mobilize from sympathetic tone, I think, is an important thing to recognize. You know, can I be sat here talking to you now? I'm obviously a lot more animated than I'm going to be when I'm laying at home with my wife. Am I going to be able to walk out of this room and go, and my heart rate tick down, you know, because now it's dead on 100. You know, if I'm talking to my wife at home, that better be more like 50, 60, you know?
So when, you know, we're talking about these mitigation strategies and stuff like that, which I think absolutely should be pioneered more, and I commend you for doing that. When you're generally intaking new clients and you're trying to put them on this new protocol, model, you know, whatever terminology we want to use, what are the most common bad practices that you're running into that you have to undo, other than the more is more? You know, what are the things you most often have to go, that shit doesn't work?
We're talking about brain health or across the board?
Let's go, sorry, so for PDs, when you're taking on clients and you start controlling those variables for them, outside of just the attitude of more is better, what are the really common misconceptions that you're running into that where you're like, oh, that myth needs to die, or, you know, whatever?
My biggest fear when I take on a client is, have you had an echocardiogram? That's my biggest fear straight off the bat, because people go, I can't afford it, it's too expensive. And I was like, okay, that's how much is it going to cost you if you die? Because if you've got, say, a valve defect, some underlying condition, some congenital heart problem, and you take drugs, that's going to exacerbate that consistently.
You always think it's never going to be you.
We've had friends that have died that had an underlying issue. Yeah,
one of my best friends a couple of years ago.
Last year.
I literally spoke to him on the Thursday.
It was last year.
Was it last year?
Last year.
On the Friday, I got a message from his fiancée. They're about to be married 2 weeks later. Gone into hospital. He's just had a heart attack.
And he had a congenital issue that could have been picked up.
Yeah.
And we consistently push this button because people think, oh, it's a cost. I was like, yes, it is.
And this was not a high-dose PED user. This was a TRT guy.
Yeah.
You know?
This is the thing. That's probably the one that concerns me the most. The health side of things, blood work, oh, it's too expensive. And I've had it before, a bit tight on money, I can't afford my blood work. And I was like, that's one thing I really want to push into the ground. That and not eating any fruits and vegetables. That seems to be this thing going around at the moment. I don't know why it is. They're like, I'm pushing up. I'm taking all these drugs. I'm not going to be concerned about antioxidant support, fiber for one. Maybe they watched too much Liver King and seen he's jacked. They're like, I'm going to go for this guy. But there's something about it where they just sort of almost like neglect of the diet, even for bodybuilders.
It's comedy, man. The fruit and vegetable thing is comedy because it's obviously your number one way of quenching oxidative stress. You know, the number one thing that you're pounding at with everything that you do. And it's probably the most common thing with clients I've had over the years that have been like, Joe, I can't do that. Like 1.2 kilos of fruit and vegetables a day. But then every single time without fail, my digestion's never been this good. I've never been so hungry between it, because people see the food volume and the fiber content and they think that's going to slow everything down. When, you know, you have to pay attention to soluble and insoluble ratios and whatnot, and, you know, make sure everything's done properly. But, you know, it's going to increase gastric emptying rate, improve gastric motility and things like that. It's the number one thing. Is like,
I'm laughing because I've had it before when people are like, I've literally all I've done is put a kilo of fruits and vegetables. They're like, you're a fucking wizard. And
I've never felt so good. My skin's never looked so good.
Am I a wizard? Am I a wizard, really? But that's what always makes me chuckle. But
Sorry.
No.
I'll answer your question about the PEDs as well. So the most common things, among my stable of clients, which is these days, it's normally like national level or pro competitors, male and female. The most typical one is, I don't want to say non-intelligent focus or structure to stack design. And when I say stack design, let's say just androgens here. We're talking, you know, some amount of testosterone, some amount of a DHT derivative, maybe some amount of a 19 norandrogen as well. And just kind of put together in just this way, you know, not really that they've worked up to it to structure it to what their needs are. And then the use of ancillaries to control for the off-target issues that are resultant from the improper management of that. And that would be the most common. And rather than using too much, it's not that common. You know, most of my clients will be somewhere in the 1 to 2 gram range at peak load, given that they're competing on national pro kind of stage. And very rarely do I have to move their dosages down, but very commonly it will be moving around of the doses of what they're on to reduce or remove the ancillaries that are going to be deleterious long term, most notably AIs. You know, and building in prophylactics like you mentioned of like telmisartan and metformin, maybe including more growth hormone or more insulin, because people, you know, if you look at the clinical dosages of growth hormone that's used, for example, in populations, it's like they're insane, 16 units, 30 units. And then look at the clinical dosages that are used in androgens, and we're using like 10 times on the androgen and then like 10% on the GH. You're like, actually, we can generate some like good safety testing outcomes by looking at these. And actually, that 10 units of GH, not that I'm advocating for that, but it's going to be far less deleterious than 3 grams of testosterone, you know?
Sure. So there are kind of some cards that they're pushing too hard, for sure.
Yeah.
And then other cards that they're not.
What I was going to mention was you see it a lot at the moment. You get a lot of people who are scared of things like insulin, which we can come on to in a bit. They're terrified of insulin, but they're like, right, I'm going to take this drug that has been never been tested for human use. I heard some influencer talking about this peptide. I want to take that. I'm like, I'm a bit confused. Like, you got this drug that's got no safety data, might have been just tested in rats, hasn't been hasn't been ever studied. We don't even know what dose we need to take in humans. But they're like, fuck, I can't take insulin. I was like, do you drink coffee? And they're like, yeah. I was like, LD50 of coffee is greater than that of, so it was lower than that of insulin. So like, you're more likely to kill yourself with a caffeine overdose.
Haven't you done that though?
Tried to,
well, not kill yourself. Nearly did.
Kill myself. I got hospitalised with a caffeine overdose because I took caffeine powder thinking it was creatine because I'm a fucking idiot.
Oh, that'll do it.
That will do it. Yeah. That was not a peak moment.
I accidentally took 250 milligrams of yohimbine once. Yeah, that was mad.
Have you come down yet?
I was like somewhere in between worrying about dying and having the weirdest sex of my life.
Don't look at me when you say
That should be somewhere everyone should strive to get to once, though, surely.
The most unreal libido coupled with fear of death. Yeah,
right there,
that's incredible.
Yeah, this was like before yohimbine was a thing, and like not many people were using it. And I got raw from China. And it was like my first time using milligram scales.
You the wrong.
Yeah, I didn't tear it properly. Yeah, it was rough day that was. I was laying there thinking, oh, I must be mobilising so much fat. That's the only way I could like get myself through it.
I'm gonna be so shredded when I come down from this.
She was going, your eyes are so red. They were like this table, man.
I just said to her, I think I've killed myself.
Yeah.
Good. Let's go down the insulin route then. Since you mentioned it, what roadblocks or good practices are you kind of looking at there with insulin?
We tend to see the roadblocks mainly people's perception of it. I think people see this drug that's going to kill them instantly. And I mean, unless you're type 1 diabetic, which obviously is not going to kill you instantly, but obviously can be a factor, you're not really going to run into those problems. It's going to synergize with anabolics, with GH in a fantastic way. It's going to offer some, certainly in the form of like Lantus and things like that, it's going to offer you some sort of load off your pancreas, can offer you some fantastic nutrient partitioning alongside that kind of peri-workout nutrition. Offer some really unique benefits there, and it's going to allow us to maybe go to a situation with anabolics, GH, and insulin is like 1 + 1 + 1 = 5. So it's going to do some great stuff, but people are like, I couldn't take that because I'm going to die. Like, where's that come from? And I think they've heard someone on YouTube or something say that's going to be the case. When if we look at the case study reports, the actual ability to kill yourself with these drugs is very, very low. It's only ever intentional. Like, I've overdosed on insulin one time. Like I inject myself with the wrong. I woke up one morning.
Yeah, called me, bro. What do I do?
I messaged you. I said I think I've
Eat some carbs.
Yeah, you'll be fine.
injected the wrong Lantus. I thought I'd injected Lantus. I was half asleep, and I injected Nova Rapid 30 units. And I was like, again, I probably shouldn't be talking about safer use drugs when I've obviously been an idiot myself.
Yeah, but who else is better to say that?
exactly.
Don't do that. Like, the thing is, you know what to do. I was never in any danger. It was just a stupid thing to do.
Yeah, the LD50 of Lantus is 1,000 units, and I'm not sure what it's like over here, because I've seen you guys get vials, but everything that we get is in a pen, 300 unit pen. So unless you're pinning more than 3 pens,
and it's 60 turns on a pen, I believe.
Yeah.
So you have to really get
and
it.
look, if someone's watching this, they're going to the comments like, insulin kills people and stuff. Insulin has killed people, mostly type 1 diabetics. It's pretty damn hard to kill yourself. Can you go hypo and pass out? Yes. Can you have a seizure? Yes. Is your pancreas going to kick out glucagon to bring your blood glucose back up? Yes. You're not going to die. It's not a good thing, though. It's not nice to go super hypo. It's not good for your muscle, that's for sure. It's going to crank up muscle protein breakdown crazy to cleave some glucagon. But what it is very well tolerated at reasonable dosages and can be used prophylactically as a health management tool. Running extremely high blood glucose, especially in the presence of high exogenous growth hormone, like a lot of bodybuilders or especially powerlifters and strength athletes are doing, living in a state of constant insulin resistance. If you can prophylactically use a basal insulin like Lantus at true therapeutic dosages, which is going to be in like the 10 to 20, maybe 30 if you're under real high food caloric load, it's going to do you a favour.
Especially when you think about oxidative stress, atherosclerotic risk. Imagine a super heavyweight bodybuilder's diet at that point. You're talking about your endothelial function's gone out the window. So when you talk about your risk factors and using a prophylactic, a lot of these anti-aging clinics are using basal insulin.
Yeah, I see that here in the States a lot. Yeah, a lot of basal insulin use.
Outside of pushing muscle growth to new levels, what do you see then in terms of like resting blood sugar, A1C and stuff like that when you start implementing smart insulin usage with individuals?
I mean, I'd like to think it shouldn't be the main focus of keeping someone's blood glucose in range. Obviously, we're talking about using it to kind of take off a bit of you don't want to redline the pancreas. We're talking about taking a bit of load off. Your blood glucose control and everything should be done via kind of being at reasonable body fat. I mean, we did a seminar quite recently and people said, what's the biggest tip of staying healthy? And I was like, don't get fat. Basically, I was like, I'm not saying that, I'm saying it kind of tongue in cheek, but I'm also being legit with that as well. Keep it at a reasonable level of body fat, keep your cardio in, eat well. Your blood glucose is probably going to stay in a good range.
To be specific about, sorry to cut you off there, just before you go on, to be specific about insulin sensitivity as well. Blood glucose is a marker that has utility. It's useful for us to track, maybe chronically more so than acutely, but it is only one side of the coin. You do also have to look at your blood insulin. I typically use a HOMA IR test with my clients, homeostatic model assessment of insulin resistance, because I've had clients that present like, you remember Brandon Dacruz? His like blood glucose are always super high, but he's peeled all the time. So goes and gets a HOMA IR, his blood insulin's super low, run that through that program, and he's actually really insulin sensitive. So just looking at blood glucose and being like, yeah, man, I've got a 3.3 blood glucose. It's awesome. And I pin 200 units of Lantus every day to keep it there. If you've got mega high blood insulin, it's no good.
Yeah, hyperinsulinemia is not a good place to be. You're going to get long-term insulin resistance from that. So
yeah, so if you are, for example, the reason I say this is because some people will say, well, I program my insulin use based on my blood glucose. It's like, well, that could be a never-ending scale. As you get more insulin resistant, you just take more insulin and become more and more hyperinsulinemic, and just sort of falsely push your blood glucose down. You have to be managing these things with at least a fasted insulin to pair it with your own fasted blood glucose, if not a HOMA IR.
And do you think that then becomes more and more important, as you mentioned, like growth hormone is maybe a card that doesn't get pushed hard enough, but obviously that has effects on insulin and blood sugar and stuff. So if people are going down the route of pushing those things up higher, which from my knowledge, you may well correct me here and please do, like as people turn pro and can afford to invest more in their cycles, growth hormone tends to be one of those things that gets pushed up more.
What I find quite typically is that people go through this process where they do push up growth hormone. They might start playing with more like exotic ranges, like 15 units and 20 units, and they all seem to eventuate back down to 8 to 10.
Bankrupt.
Well, the anecdote across the board, and growth hormone's a really interesting one. In fact, I've never seen a PED educator like, have you heard of Chester Rockwell? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is a name most people have never heard of, anonymous guy. He was on the Blast and Cruise forum as a private forum back in the day. One of these places that I'll always owe a lot to Chester because he was a mega evidence-based guy, but always anonymous. He wrote for MesoRx these amazing growth hormone articles, like Growth Hormone Protocol for Hypertrophy. And you cannot imagine the intricacy of that molecule in its relationship to hypertrophy or lipolysis. So it's not particularly clear if there is a dose response, but to what degree that is, and what downstream cascades on systemic IGF-1 versus autocrine and paracrine IGF-1, and whether that systemic IGF-1 is a negative feedback regulator of autocrine and paracrine IGF-1, things like this. It gets messy on the pharmacology. But part of that being, and what he postulated, was that there is a dose by which systemic IGF-1 would be so high that there would be a negative feedback impact on, when I say autocrine, paracrine, IGF-1, for anybody that's listening, it's like inside and outside the cell, like the skeletal muscle cell, which is where we want it. And androgens increase mRNA expression of IGF-1 in the muscle cells, so that's why that synergy is created. But there likely is a dose of growth hormone where you get a negative return on investment. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to watch that anecdotally people, in my experience anyway, other people's experience might differ, they drift back down to this 8 to 10 unit per day, like maximum, and any more than that's just an unnecessary amount of like aldosterone increase in fluid retention and things like this, you know.
Growth hormone seems to be the one for me where there seems to be like the most numerous amounts of like mythical protocols where like if you take it at night on a full moon whilst you're eating a banana or something like it does. Do you, in your experience, do you find that most of that just really needs to go out the way, and it's just like, you know, you say that 8 to 10 range there, like that's 90% of it. Like, does timing come into it in your opinion?
I think what I'd say is, so we'd have to differentiate hypertrophy versus fat loss firstly.
Of course.
Very different conditions of what the downstream mechanisms would sort of result in. So we know the fat loss impact of growth hormone is driven by its ability to mobilize free fatty acids. And there has to be certain conditions for that to take place maximally, because presence of blood insulin, blood amino acids, blood dietary fatty acids, blood glucose, that will inhibit substantially the amount of free fatty acids that can be mobilized at any one time, which means that you do want to take it in a fasted state. So that would be the reason for at least that bolus dose of growth hormone. Now, luckily for us, there is a study that we went through on the Physique Collective forum. I've done some videos on it where they look at the dose response of free fatty acid mobilization from a single bolus dose of growth hormone. And bearing in mind this was intravenous, I did some sort of rough calculations on what the equivalent would be subcutaneous. And it's looking about 1.5 units per 100 kilos of body weight is where you're going to top out at least the free fatty acid mobilization effects of growth hormone. So let's say you're a female and you only want the fat loss impact and you weigh 50 kilos. Well, 0.75 units fasted once a day, done. But there are other impacts that would somewhat result in improved body composition, like its impacts on metabolic flexibility, for example. So that's not reliant on the free fatty acid mobilization. That could just be, you know, over the course of a day, you're generating more insulin resistance to adipocytes, so you're going to get more glucose disposal into the muscle cell rather than, you know, adipocyte disposal of whatever substrate and things like that. So it's not to say more wouldn't result in improved body composition over time, but at least just looking at that acute window of fat loss, that's where you're going to maximize out on that. So that's what I would say for fat loss. For hypertrophy, if we're going to go down these hypotheticals that Chester Rockwell postulated that seem to be well represented in data, although a lot of people disagree, I think there are roles to systemic IGF-1 in hypertrophy. I think I heard Dr. Scott the other day say that he's more enlightened than he was previously on what that would be. I need to catch up with Scott on that. But I wouldn't be a fan of this sort of bolus dosing every other day structure, because that is going to push up systemic IGF-1 aggressively. And if that is a negative feedback regulator of local IGF-1, then you're not going to be getting your best bang for your buck from that. In fact, if we want to really go down on that and say, okay, it likely is a negative feedback regulator, then some form of microdosing would be best, maybe twice per day or 3 times a day if you can be bothered to do. That's going to depend on the dose, isn't it? Like if you're doing 10 units, yeah, I'd probably do 5 and 5, you know.
With that fat loss benefit that you're talking about, the fasting, when they're looking at the upregulation of the, you know, fatty acid mobilization, is there like a time window in which that
Yeah.
As in, like, is there an argument to be made for doing that multiple times through the day to get that?
It's quite a long area under the curve, and it peaks quite late.
So it's 6 to 8 hours.
4 to 6 hours is like variability of peak. So what I would typically do is have my clients inject that before bed, you know, and they're going to have significant free fatty acid mobilization when they wake up. And then you can use other compounds that drive synergies for the whole lipolysis process. Clenbuterol works on fatty acid oxidation. Your himbine is also going to push up free fatty acid mobilization.
As long as you get your micrograms right.
Yeah, don't buy raws from China and weigh it out. Not at least with, oh God, don't do that with clenbuterol.
Yeah, of course.
Tachycardia, see. Yeah, you know, your himbine, your injectable L-carnitine, if you want to push the shuttle in the transport of the fatty acids and whatnot, yeah, there's... we were talking about growth hormone.
No. You mentioned L-carnitine and stuff like that. Like, that stuff is kind of bleeding into bodybuilding more and more now. Do you see that as being like kind of bodybuilding like 3.0, where people are now taking advantage of? We've probably, I say we've maxed out. You know, you guys are doing a lot to make sure people are getting the most out of those drugs that have been around for longer, but we've kind of we're not going to invent another Deca or whatever, right? So do you see these peptides kind of coming in now and playing a big role long term, or do you think it's going to be more of a fad or something that is just like an ancillary player?